Good evening, call out. This is our second attempt at getting this debate started. The topic at hand is my assertion that Mick Foley is the greatest professional wrestler of all time. In Genuine, you'll want to leave your video feed up while I talk, otherwise we might have trouble getting you back. And my understanding is that Genuine, his assertion is that Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson is a superior professional wrestler to Mick Foley. So we'll kind of go down that angle. I will be mostly defending Mick Foley. I'll let Genuine structure his argument how he wants. So to introduce the call-out audience to who we're talking about, Michael Francis Foley, also known as Mick Foley, is a professional wrestler who started in 1986, and he's still active today, although he hasn't done anything in the ring since 2012. So still an extremely long career for a professional wrestler. His earliest exposure was in WCW as Cactus Jack. When he left WCW, he did work in ECW, Extreme Championship Wrestling, in some independent territories, and in Japan, where he became known as King of the Deathmatch. Now, Mick Foley is best known for being the hardcore legend or the hardcore icon. He became best known as King of the Deathmatch in Japan. He was involved in matches where the ropes were replaced with barbed wire. He was involved in matches with tables set on fire, turnbuckles that were rigged with C4, although they were actually less powerful explosives, most likely. Thumbtacks, which people would throw each other onto, not to mention your traditional, chairs, ladder shots, cage matches, people coming off of the cage. So while he is known for these things, my endeavor this evening is to present my case that Mick Foley is the greatest wrestler of all time because he was able to take those hardcore elements and instead of presenting them in a meaningless way, he was able to establish why they mattered within the context of a given match. He was able to tell a story using those elements rather than just having them as standalone elements. He was able to withstand the punishment of throwing those elements into his matches, and he was able to keep a match going and keep up the suspension of belief while taking these very real injuries. So I will now pass the mic to Genuine for his introductory statement.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me this time. Okay, as I started to say before, I am not taking anything away from Mick Foley. Trust me, I am a Mick Foley fan. However, if I was to rank the greatest wrestlers of all time, Mick Foley would be somewhere around 3 or 4. While Mick Foley has had a lot of memorable matches, i.e., and I'm sure you're going to bring up his matches versus The Undertaker coming off the top of the cage. While some of those matches are memorable, when you think of professional wrestling in WWE, there's certain people that come to the forefront of that. One being The Rock, then you have your Triple H, and you have your Undertakers, as well as Hulk Hogan. While he has been good, I'll say that he hasn't made it to the point of being considered one of the greats. Everything that he's done has been done before and done better. Maybe not everything, but for the major stuff. Not to mention, when you think of promos, when I think of promos, you think of The Rock and you think of Triple H. When you think of longevity, you think of people like The Undertaker. In every category, when it comes to just thinking about professional wrestling, Mick Foley, while he might be in the top 10, he does not crack the top 3 on any of these categories. With that being said, I'll wait for you. Like I said, for everything you bring up, I'm pretty sure that The Rock has accomplished it because I do have my list of stats also.
You already have passed it back to me. Okay. Well, the first thing I want to get to with Mick Foley, in terms of his greatness as a wrestler, is the variety of characters that he brought to the ring. Most commonly known are the three faces of Foley. Early in his career, Mick Foley acted as Cactus Jack, who was sort of an unhinged, vaguely criminal character, a heel, which is what we know as a bad guy in wrestling terminology. And he was a genuinely frightening man. At this stage in his career, he was still extremely mobile despite being a large man. And he was willing not only to take a lot of pain himself, but to dish it out to his opponents. For an example, I'll point to a match not many people are probably familiar with, and that is his 1992 match against Sting. And this was Sting before he was doing the Crow gimmick. This was basically Mick Foley's first big-time match at Beach Blast 1992. And despite the fact that Cactus Jack and Sting were polar opposite characters, he was able to take his style and make Sting look very good doing it, even though Sting was nothing like a hardcore wrestler. When he brought the Cactus Jack character back to WWE, he did so as a face, and he spent a lot of time putting guys like, at that time, Triple H, Randy Orton, and others over by taking those crazy bumps, but he was back to being his crazy self. Now, in the meantime, when he first came to WWE, he wrestled as Mankind, who was a completely different character, a deranged character wearing a mask. And you talk about promos, Mankind's promos were some of the craziest and yet most successful things that the WWE audience had seen. Mankind was one of the pivotal characters that ushered in what we know as the Attitude Era because of the boundaries that he pushed. And specifically, he was a big reason that The Undertaker developed a mystique that he did, because he gave The Undertaker a genuine opponent that was in the same level of supernatural. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you had Dude Love, the fun-loving hippie, which he played for a short time in WWE, but it established he could go completely outside of the crazy and just play your standard fun-loving dancing dude, and it worked just as well. Meanwhile, I would challenge you to find more than one successful note in The Rock's character repertoire. Go ahead.
Okay, with that being said, okay, so we're talking about Mick Foley, and I guess this is almost turned into a Mick Foley versus The Rock. All right. After pretty much a lot of people who know wrestling know who Stone Cold Steve Austin is. What some people might not know is after Stone Cold got his accident with his neck, that he was unable to wrestle. Throughout wrestling, there's always been a person who's been called like the face of this or the face of WWE. A lot of times for people, if they're currently watching wrestling, they probably know John Cena, who would be considered the face of WWE right now. Well, after Stone Cold, Hulk Hogan, at one point, Hulk Hogan held this mantle. At one point, Stone Cold held this. While after Stone Cold, that was passed on to The Rock. While Mankind has had some memorable matches, while Mankind has done some memorable stuff, he has never been called the face of the WWE. He's never had to hold that whole company on his back, as in headlining all these. If you compare pay-per-view main events, like right now, if you compare pay-per-view main events for Mick Foley, you come up with 32 pay-per-view main events. While on the other hand, you have The Rock has 48 main events. That's 48 times main events. If you look at the highest attendance card that Mick Foley has ever had for something he main evented, you have the 97 Royal Rumble, which was at, I'll even round up and give it 61,000 people that was at that card right there. While you can go, also, that was 97, in case I missed it. While you go to Dwayne The Rock Johnson, and you have something that's more recent, which is the 2016 WrestleMania, which rung in at 101,000 people. And let me round up for that too, just to be fair, 102,000. So also, when you think of memorable feuds, for those who watch wrestling, you think of memorable feuds. And when you think of memorable feuds with The Rock, you have Stone Cold, you have Triple H. While with the Undertaker, while with Mick Foley, you probably have the Undertaker. Memorable Stone Cold, correction, Mick Foley's most memorable time was probably as part of the Rock and Sock connection when he was tag team with The Rock, in which I go so far as to say he was riding on the coattails and the popularity of The Rock at this time. And I'll go ahead and pass it back to you at this time.
All right, well, now we get into the business of wrestling a little bit. First of all, the first thing that I want to go to as an example of this, you were talking about pay-per-view main events. Main events are booked. They're not earned. It's the promoter who decides who is in the main event, who goes on last. You talked about The Rock last year. The Rock came up and he had a 6-second match in which he beat a guy named Eric Rowan, who is not even a major player. The actual main event last year was Triple H, who is a part-timer and the son of the promoter, versus Roman Reigns, who has a strong family connection to The Rock himself as well as the promoter. So really, main events are just proof that you are in good with the promoter. You talk about being the face of a franchise. That's also a promoter thing. And that has not always been the case, because there is not centralized pro wrestling is a relatively new concept. For most of the history of wrestling, you had individual territories and stars moved back and forth between them. And you would have a guy who was the champion in one promotion for 2, 3, 4, sometimes as much as 9 years at a time, because he was that promotion's one guy. But that guy wouldn't be the biggest guy in the sport. That would be whoever was traveling from town to town and who brought an audience with him. And that's what Mick Foley has done. Speaking of championship success, probably one of the bellwether moments of the Attitude Era was when Mick Foley won his first individual championship in 1998. Because what happened, this was during the Monday Night Wars, and trying to make fun of WWF, who had pre-taped Raw earlier that day and the results had got out on television, the WCW announcing crew made fun of the fact that Mick Foley was going to win the WWF Championship later that night. What happened was that a massive number of people changed the channels from Monday Nitro to Monday Night Raw to watch Mick Foley win that championship, because these were people that Foley brought with him wherever they went. And if you look at the numbers, WCW's ratings never recovered. And it led directly to their being sold to WWE in 2001, effectively ending them as a promotion. So they never made Mick Foley a main eventer, and it killed them in the end, especially when they made fun of WWE for, at that time, WWF for putting him in a main event.
Okay. Yes, you are correct in when you're talking about when you're bringing up the match with Mick Foley and the ratings. That was the beginning of the big switch with the ratings. However, that was not what sustained it and continued the WWE in their takeoff. So I guess what I want to mention is, yes, you did say that main events are booked and stuff like that, but the main events, they're booked based off the draw that the person can get and the appeal to the crowd and overall performance. Maybe I'm just throwing that last part in, but in measurable stats, and maybe I'm wrong, in measurable stats, you have Mick Foley with 421 total matches in his career. You have The Rock with 381, which is less by about 40, 50. I'm just looking at this on the screen. However, the win percentage, Mick Foley has a 53.3% winning, while The Rock has a 59.4%. When you look at losses, now I do understand that some of it is bumps and some of it is putting other people over, but The Rock has been used to put more people over. The Rock has put over Brock Lesnar. The Rock has put over John Cena. The Rock has been brought back time and time and time again to add more crowds and bigger people to these WWE matches, because after all this time, he can still draw. The Rock is one of the few people who's been able to, I had to check, go back and look at my time. Okay, minute 15. The Rock has been one of the few people that's been able to make it from WWE and make it to where he is now, which is the biggest box office draw that we have. So, like I said, as I was mentioning this stat, so The Rock has a higher win percentage and a lower loss percentage. Pay-per-view matches, he has more pay-per-view wins with a 53.16% win, while Mick Foley has 31.8. Once again, Mick Foley has 64.8 loss, while The Rock has 44.3. Not to mention titles, which is something else that can be measurable. You can go off world championships, while Mankind or Mick Foley has 4. The Rock has 10. One of the best things, and this is one, there's something called a Triple Crown winner. The Triple Crown winner is somebody who's won the top 3 championships of a certain promotion. For WWE, that would be the World Championship, the Intercontinental Championship, and the Tag Team Championship. The Rock has done that. He was the 6th person to actually accomplish that. While that's something that Mick Foley has not ever accomplished, that's not
okay. Your time ran out on you there. So now we can transition rather smoothly into the next stage of my argument, which is about storytelling. Now, you brought up two of the least relevant things in professional wrestling: wins and titles. Guys, you might want to get your kids away from the screen for a minute, because I'm about to break the biggest non-secret about professional wrestling. Professional wrestling is predetermined. It's not fake. The action is real. The endings are predetermined. And who wins a match on a given night is in many times decided minutes before the match starts. Titles are another thing that's just picked by the promoter based on preference, whoever they want to put in front of a television. Now, a big part of my argument about Mick Foley's greatness is what he was able to do for his opponents in losses. Now, you go all the way back. I already mentioned Sting, but the first major feud a lot of people will know Mick Foley for is The Undertaker. In the majority of Undertaker and Mankind's matches, Undertaker won. In fact, in their most infamous match, which was Hell in a Cell in 1998, Undertaker not only won, he threw Mick Foley off of the cell twice. This effectively established The Undertaker as the heartless monster that we know him as today. It led into the corporate ministry angle and his heel run, which is where he really picked up most of his momentum. The Rock, another person that Mick Foley put over, first by being his tag team partner, but also by feuding with him. Stone Cold Steve Austin, Mick Foley put him over as Dude Love, and also put him over as Mankind. When we say put someone over, that means you lose to them in order to make them look good. All these people, Mick Foley has selflessly turned into the superstars that they're known as. You go to more recent times, and in 2006, probably his last major match, Mick Foley put over Edge, who became one of the company's water carriers for the next several years. At an advanced age and already suffering several severe injuries, he allowed Edge to throw him into a pile of tacks and then spear him off of the ring apron through a table that had been set on fire. Infamously, at the bottom of the pile, Foley said to Edge, "My wife's going to kill me," because Foley had told his wife he wasn't going to take any crazy bumps that night. So a big part of Mick Foley's greatness is his willingness to be the guy who loses, but who elevates his opponent to that superstar status.
I agree 100%, and that's why The Rock still beats that, because, like I said, The Rock took the time to put over those people like John Cena, those people like Brock Lesnar. Not to mention, there's been certain matches that, though it is through promoters and stuff like that, like if you listen to Jim Ross talk, of course, every match that Stone Cold has is a slobber knocker or something like that. But there are certain matches who are set apart from everything else. For example, what was called the Icon versus Icon match, which is Hulk Hogan versus The Rock. This was a time when the Hulk Hogan was passing the reins over to The Rock. Triple H, I don't know why I keep saying Triple H. I don't know why, but Mick Foley has never had a match like that. Like I said, not to mention, you cannot bring up, I heard you bring up like promos and stuff like that. My God, I don't even know if you can even quantify the popularity of the promos that The Rock has versus the promos that Mankind has or Mick Foley. You look at Know Your Role and Shut Your Mouth. You look at the SmackDown Hotel. You look at one of the most viewed promos of all time, which is the It's Your Birthday Rock, which you can probably debate that because Mankind and The Rock took place in that, but you will never see a very popular thing that Mick Foley had while The Rock wasn't there. However, there are many, many things that The Rock did that were popular that Mankind wasn't there. Like I said, I think if you talk about something as far as getting the crowd involved, I'm seriously trying to think of something that Mankind did. Maybe he has the Have a Nice Day. Maybe that's something like that you can bring up. But other than that, the most memorable things that you can think, like memorable promos, if you think of those, The Rock cuts the best promos hands down, better than anybody. Probably the only person that could rival him on promos and drawing the crowd in and getting the crowd involved is probably Stone Cold. As far as promos go, Mankind is nowhere even in the running. Also with memorable matches, man. If you talk about the early 2000s, when you're going with The Rock versus Triple H, these are matches that carried years. These carried the company for years, not just one match every decade or so. And my time is almost up.
Well, now that leads us to one final point on storytelling. You wanted an example of something that Mick Foley brought that got the crowd involved and that had longevity. And I present to you Mr. Sacco. Mr. Sacco, for those of you who are not familiar with pro wrestling, started as a one-off gag where Vince McMahon was supposed to be injured and laid up in the hospital. And Mankind, who Mick Foley was wrestling at the time, brought Yerple the Clown to try to cheer Vince McMahon up. When Mick Foley realized that Yerple was becoming the star of the segment and that he was not getting noticed, he took off his athletic sock, he drew a face on it, and he turned it into a sock puppet and annoyed Mr. McMahon with it. And when he got to the arena, Pat Patterson asked Mick Foley, "Do you still have the sock?" And Mick said, "Yeah, why?" Pat Patterson said, "They're cheering for it." From then until the end of his career, Mick Foley used Mr. Sacco as part of his gimmick. This cost my wife $25. They still sell to this day. It's a sock. He got a sock over. By the way, the last time that Mr. Sacco got a pop from the crowd, last week on Monday Night Raw, he pulled that thing out and it was just like it was 2008 again. Now, you keep saying things like The Rock put over John Cena, and that's going to bring me back around to longevity, because I want to make sure people understand the last time that The Rock wrestled John Cena was in 2013 when he came back for 2 matches. And you know what he did? He took the title from John Cena as a guy who was not even with the company. Now, that rolls us into the issue of longevity, because the 2 guys you keep bringing up are The Rock and Stone Cold Steve Austin. I'll table Stone Cold for later because his career was shortened due to injury. But The Rock started in 1996. His full-time career with WWE ended in 2002. That is 6 years of full-time wrestling. The match that you talk about with Hulk Hogan, that was when he came back as a part-timer. And that match was not supposed to be what it was. He turned heel in that match because people were cheering for Hogan over him, because they were mad that he had abandoned them for Hollywood. Since 2002, he has been nothing but a part-time wrestler who just shows up when he's got a movie to promote, whereas Mick Foley is a professional wrestling lifer. That is a huge, huge distinction you can't get around.
Okay, just so you know, yes, after this is over, I'm gonna have to wipe down my monitor because you really made me spit water on my screen just now when you pulled out the sock. I can't believe you pulled out a sock just now. Okay, with that being said, longevity. We're speaking of longevity. Okay, yes, Mick Foley has had the longer career. However, when you're talking about bang for the buck, as in the shortest career with the most accomplishments, the greatest wrestler, while we can debate who had the longer career, we're talking about who's the greatest wrestler of all time. And with that, it's like I said, everything that's measurable, the most memorable matches. The Rock has had more matches that would be considered the memorable matches. Who's had the biggest crossover appeal as far as WWE and making it to Hollywood? Yes, Mick Foley has had more Cactus Jack, Mick Foley, and stuff like that. However, The Rock is still coming back. I don't know if you covered when was the last time that Mick Foley was actually in the ring, but honestly, the last few times that Mick Foley was in a feud, he was getting jumped. And what happened? If you smell, the sound goes off, and then The Rock comes in to help. That's like the last three memorable feuds that I've seen Mick Foley in. Now, of course, he is the the manager of Monday Night Raw with Stephanie McMahon. However, there are certain things that are measurable, and there's certain things that aren't. Like, for instance, do you remember? You cannot say you didn't know the pop when you're talking about pops with the sock, and I'm talking about when they announced who's going to be the I'll have to call it commissioner for the time being, the commissioner of WrestleMania, and which was the last big time that The Rock came back. The lights went dark. They had no idea who this guy was going to be. Then all of a sudden, once again, the sound hit, and it was The Rock again. The Rock, but because of the mere fact that Vince McMahon makes sure that The Rock is on every single poster that when it's time for WrestleMania. Whenever it's WrestleMania time, they make sure they go ahead and call up The Rock and get him back out there. It is awesome. I was in a WWE live event here, and he threw his shirt off, and the guy paid like $600 for that shirt. My wife took a picture with the shirt, but as far as memorabilia, The Rock has the most memorable stuff. I have 5 shirts in my closet right now for The Rock while you bring out a sock.
Yeah, a sock. It's not just a sock. It has Mick Foley's verified signature on it. All right. All right. Well, I think it's good to use the fact that The Rock is always on the poster around WrestleMania time to illustrate why he's not the greatest wrestler of all time. Because this year that mantle belongs to a man by the name of Bill Goldberg, who has not wrestled a match since 2004. The last match he did wrestle, he got booed out of the building. And since he came back to WWE in November, he's wrestled a grand total of about 3 minutes. So that just goes into Vince McMahon's decision-making. That's not about who's the greatest wrestler. Neither is crossover appeal relevant to greatest wrestler. If so, Rowdy Roddy Piper would have been a bigger deal than Hulk Hogan in their heyday, because at that time, Roddy was starring in more movies than Hulk was. He would have been bigger than Ric Flair, who's never had much of a movie career, but is unquestionably on the Mount Rushmore of wrestling, which I'd put Mick Foley up there with him. But talking about it's a big deal whenever The Rock comes back, that's because he's what we call a special attraction. Now, you mentioned number of matches earlier. That's the number of televised matches that you can find listed on any website. That discounts the decade and a half where Mick Foley was wrestling between 3 and 7 nights a week. So he's done work and drawn crowds that shows you and I would not be able to find any sort of record of. Now, as far as why it's been so long since we've seen Mick Foley wrestle a full match, his career was ended by injuries. In fact, he's headed to get hip surgery soon right now. And it's because of all that he put his body through in order to entertain the fans and in order to sell the product and keep the realism going around the product. One thing that he did that very few people today even can do is that even if he was badly injured, he would keep a match going. That Hell in a Cell match that we brought up a few times with Undertaker, he had broken ribs, missing teeth, I believe a lacerated kidney, and he refused to let that match go with anything but a clean finish, actually getting pinned. And then most people don't remember this. Later that night, before he ever went to the hospital, he came out because he had a scheduled run-in another match. So the reason his career was shortened, and it was still 30 years long, was because of what he did in the ring to sell a product and to entertain the fans. The reason The Rock's career was short is because he wanted to go to Hollywood and make money. The reason Stone Cold's career was shorter was because he got injured, but the reason he spent less time at the top was that he had two previous gimmicks, the Ringmaster and Stunning Steve Austin, which both fell flat. All of Mick Foley's gimmicks have gotten over the years.
Okay, so I don't know if this is going to be closing it out, but my point is this. Anything that's measurable when you're talking about wrestling, anything that's measurable, then The Rock has an up on Mick Foley. And like I said, let me just run through these one more time. The highest win percentage. Mick Foley has a 53% win percentage, while The Rock has a 59.4. Loss percentage. Mick Foley has a 35.4, while The Rock has a 30.8, which means he's lost more matches. Most pay-per-view matches. Mick Foley does have more pay-per-view matches, which means he's just been in more pay-per-views because he has had a longer career than The Rock. Mick Foley has had 91, while The Rock has only had 79. However, when you look at wins, Mick Foley has only 29 wins in pay-per-views, while The Rock has 42. Once again, the highest attendance card that Mick Foley was ever a part of drew 60,477, while The Rock had 101,763. Also, I'm going to note on that is that match, the highest attendance card for Mick Foley was in 1997, while The Rock's was in 2016, which shows that The Rock is still continuing to draw because he's still that good. Pay-per-view main events. Mick Foley has 32, while Mick Foley has 32, while The Rock has 48. WWF championships or WWE championships, Mick Foley has 4, while The Rock has 10. Once again, The Rock is what's considered to be a triple crown winner, meaning that he's won the top 3 championships, or he's been booked to win the top 3 championships in this promotion. That is something that Mick Foley has never done. Not to mention, there's one thing. The Rock is the only wrestler ever, still to this day, to beat Hulk Hogan, John Cena, and Stone Cold, which are arguably the face of WWE at a certain point. The Rock is the only person to ever have beat all 3 of those at a WrestleMania. There are certain things that, like I said, there's measurable data that you can say. Everything else is just personal opinion. Now, if you want to go back and forth on who you think it is and who I think it is, then we will never want to debate on that. But as far as anything that's measurable data in wrestling, the Rock wins hands down. The only thing in all of my stats, the only thing that Mankind or Mick Foley has over The Rock is hardcore championships. That's it. But other than that, The Rock wins.
You're looking at WWE stats for that assertion. The problem is The Rock only ever worked in WWE. He only worked there for 6 years. And as we've talked about, titles and wins are predetermined and not really indicative of anything. For instance, if you went back in comic book history, you would probably find out that even the greatest villains have fewer successful episodes than even the minor superheroes. That's just because of the roles they play. Mick Foley wrestled most of his career as a heel, which is, like we talked about, a wrestling bad guy. The Rock and Stone Cold wrestled most of their career, or at least the successful parts, as baby faces. They're going to have more wins because of the nature of the storytelling. But that's what I want to end with on my part. The truly great moments of wrestling are not quantifiable in terms of money or in terms of attendance. They're quantifiable in terms of how well the story was told. The greatest matches don't always happen on the best cards. By the way, The Rock's 6-second match at WrestleMania probably wasn't the reason anybody showed up, since he wasn't on the poster. But the real quantifiable thing about wrestling is how it makes you feel. And consistently throughout his career, when Mick Foley has been in a wrestling match, he has made fans feel like what they were seeing is real. Rock, in many of his best moments, especially that 6-second squash of Eric Rowan last year, has not relied on suspension of belief. He just shows up and he puts on a show, and everybody accepts that it's not real. They just want to see The Rock because he's funny and he's good looking. Mick Foley keeps the realism, even to this day, when he shows up in a non-in-ring role. And that is what makes a truly great wrestler, that ability to cause the audience to suspend reality.
You know, and I'm going to assume that you're a lifelong WWE fan or a lifelong wrestling fan, as I am. I remember, as far back as I can remember wrestlers like Terry Taylor and the old Sting when he wore the really, really, really bright colors before he had his current little thing of being like the Crow. And there are certain things that have caused me to always love wrestling, and it is about the characters, and I completely agree with you 100% that it's not about wins and losses. It's about that crowd being able to connect with somebody who they either hate or somebody they consider to be a hero. And for me, like I said, and I don't want you to think I'm tearing up or anything like that talking about The Rock, which I do have in my man cave that I'm not in right now. I do have a picture of The Rock on the wall, but the Rock's character, he hasn't had to have as many characters. He hasn't had a long period of time as Mick Foley has had. However, his catchphrases and everything, him just showing his arm when he gets goosebumps when he comes back, the fact that he's one of the most profitable Hollywood stars, yet he still comes back time and time and time again. It's easy for someone like Mick Foley, and I don't, no offense against Mick Foley, but it's easy for Mick Foley to come back when he's not doing anything else. He has no other income. So yes, he comes back when he writes a book or something like that, and he needs to get it out. It needs to get more sales. But it's something completely different when one of the biggest box office draws that we have still takes the time, because he loves WWE and wrestling that much that no matter what he's doing around the world, he still comes back over and over and over again. And me being a hardcore and diehard Rock fan, that is why I consider him to be the greatest, because it's easy. There are so many wrestlers that have come back and have sucked and left. Like, you remember the run that when Batista came back, and basically he was back for a really short time. But like I said, they continue to use The Rock because he has that love. He still comes back over and over and over again. Even when he came back and went to WrestleMania and ripped out his abdomen or whatever it was, he still came back again and again. And that's something that makes him the greatest to me. It's the fact that no matter where he's at, he remembers where he came from, and he remembers that it's all about the fans. And because of that, I think The Rock is the